In the previous tutorial, we looked at setting up your Canon EOS-R for photos. Today we're going to be looking at video shooting on this same camera. The first thing you want to make sure is that you have really good batteries and backups before you start shooting video. I recommend that you buy the original Canon batteries. They last longer per shoot and also last longer in the long run. Step number one in setting up your camera is going into video mode. There's the mode button on the front, and all you do is you press that and you get into this menu where it shows you your shooting mode. Right now I'm in photo mode. If I press the info button at the back of the camera, I go into the video mode, and you can see it's the video mode by the little camera icons that you see there. Once you are in this video mode, you can then decide what auto exposure settings you want to use. You want to shoot in either auto mode, which is the first one, or right at the end you shoot in manual exposure mode, where you decide all the exposure settings, your shutter speed, your aperture and your ISO, or you can actually shoot in all these different modes. Now this camera comes with a single slot for SD cards. Now in buying your SD card, use high-speed SD card to handle high-resolution video like 4K. The next thing obviously is to put your SD card in there and then format it. For you to format your SD card, if you've watched the previous video on photos, it's just the same thing. You go into your menu and you go into this fourth wrench icon menu and go right down to the bottom, and you can format your card right there. And it's always recommended that you format your card in the camera so that the proper file structure is formed and you don't have any danger of losing your media. Once you've done that, you want to go back into the menu and you want to set your video system. And there are two main video systems, NTSC and PAL. All you need to know for this one is if you are in the US, then your system is NTSC, and for the rest of the world we use PAL. It really doesn't make much difference because these standards are broadcast standards, and they were set up for broadcast television many years ago. What they do affect, however, is the next step that we're going to be looking at, and that's where you choose your frame rates. So for PAL you get different frame rates that are available, and for NTSC you get different frame rates. So now we want to set our movie recording quality or resolution, and what you do is you navigate to this first camera icon, and the very first item on the first sub menu is your movie recording quality. And so you can see we are in PAL, and in PAL you get the following options, and this camera can record up to 4K, and you have all these options. And so 4K 25p all I is the highest quality, so you just choose what you want to shoot. If you're going to shoot 4K all I, then you make sure you have enough disk space to take up the very large files that it will form. The other thing I would say about your frame rate is that if you're going to be slowing down your video in post, then you want to shoot at 50p. That way you get a smoother slow motion in post-production. But if you're just shooting regular video, then just keep it at 25p. Now let me show you what happens when you are in NTSC. I go back to this tab and change the video system to NTSC, and then I go back to my camera. You can see the frame rates that are now available are different. I now have 29.97, which is basically 30 frames per second, and for the faster frame rate I have 59.94, which is 60 frames per second. So you get different options depending on which system you have chosen. I'm not going to be using 30 and 60 frames per second, so I'll just go back to PAL and choose the appropriate frame rate for me. If I want to use 24 frames per second, I can enable it here, and you can see now the movie recording size has changed to 24 frames per second. Some people prefer shooting in 24 frames per second because they say the motion looks more cinematic when you shoot in 24 frames per second. So the next thing we want to do is to set our audio, and our audio is down here, the third item, and we need to set this to manual. And as you can see, when it's in manual, I can go down to record level and then use the arrows to adjust the sound up and down. And for your adjustment to take effect, you need to press set, and then when you go back, your adjustment has been registered in the camera. So you want it to bounce between the 12 and the 0, but more towards the 12 so that your audio is not clipping. And so, for example, when I'm speaking, it's going up and up and up and up. You'll start seeing the audio meters changing color as they exceed 12, and they start getting yellow. And as I exceed even more, you see it goes to red, and that red is not good. It means the audio is clipping. So you want to keep it somewhere between the 12 and the 0, and you press enter. You can also record in auto, and the camera then just decides for you what the right levels are. The problem with auto is when you have low sound, it tries to boost the sound, and in doing so you get a lot of noise as well that is boosted. So we generally record in manual so that it is consistently at the same level. And you have other settings that you can change, like wind filter. If you are shooting in a windy environment, you may want to put that on or disable it. I just keep it on. And then finally, the attenuator is a setting that automatically suppresses sound distortion and is very useful when you're recording audio in situations where there's a risk of loud noises. One thing you always want to do is monitor your sound using headphones. Don't rely on the audio meters, because sometimes you're recording and you're actually recording noise and it looks like you're recording something. The next item we want to do is go to white balance, and you set your white balance. White balance helps us to get accurate colors. For these cameras, auto white balance really works well, but if you're having a problem with the colors, you can choose any of the other settings here, like daylight, shade, cloudy, and so on, all the way up to custom, where you can actually set your own white balance, and color temperature, where you set the white balance by actually dialing in a certain color temperature, like 4800 there, or you can set it to 55 or 54 if you're using studio lights like what I'm using right now, and set that to match your studio lights, and then you set that to OK. And then the next thing we can do is set our picture style, and this is really up to you. We have all these picture styles that are available, and picture styles are basically color grade that is already baked into your file. And so this is really up to your preference. You can experiment with all these. Most people will choose neutral or faithful. Now this camera is able to shoot in what is called log. This is a very flat profile. It looks really bad when you shoot, but it preserves your highlights and your shadows. So it has a lot of dynamic range, and it allows you to color grade later in post and get the colors that you really want. And so you can either have it on or off. When it's on, you can shoot in 8-bit or 10-bit. So 8-bit is the normal quality for the Canon Log, and if you want even higher quality, which means much bigger files, you can shoot in 10-bit, but you cannot record to the SD card in 10-bit. You have to connect an external drive you have to connect an external SSD to record in 10-bit log. So for now, I'll switch that off. And then the next thing we want to set is our focus, how we are going to do our focus. And for that, we go to the next tab that's written AF. And we have all these settings for autofocus. Probably the first one is right at the bottom, and that is whether you're going to use autofocus or you're going to use manual focus. And once you have your autofocus, you can actually choose your autofocus method, and these are all the methods that are available. I would say most of the time you're going to be using these first three. The first one is called face and tracking, and this is what you use when you're shooting people, and especially people who are moving. And so the camera will actually lock focus on something and then track, or lock focus on a person and then track that person and keep the focus. The next one is called one point autofocus. What the camera does, it uses a single point and use that single point to lock your focus. The next one is similar to single point, but the difference is that it's using a lot more of the image to focus. And these other ones are even wider, so if you're shooting things like landscapes or buildings or crowds, then you probably want to use these other methods because they use the whole frame to judge where focus should be set. So once you've set your focus method, I'll set mine to tracking. You can also go down to this one, eye detection. Mine is enabled, and it does just what it says. It detects the eyes and keep that focus. The next one that we want is movie servo. With the servo enabled, the camera will use the motors in the lens to keep hunting for focus. It then makes noise in the camera body, and if you're using your internal mic, that will be picked up in the recording. Now that we've got all that set, the next thing we want to do is to set our shutter speed. And we set our shutter speed according to what we call the 180-degree shutter rule, and that means the shutter speed is 2 times your frame rate. So for example, if I'm shooting at 24 frames per second, the shutter speed should be around 1/50, and this achieves natural motion blur. And so when we're shooting video, you set your shutter speed and you leave it alone. You don't move it. I have my shutter speed set to 1/45 of a second, and that's because I'm shooting at 25 frames per second, and on this camera 1/45 is the closest to 1/50 that I can get. So you set that and you leave it alone because that gives you the most natural motion blur. Now if you want to go for creative results, like if you're shooting a dreamy scene and you want to see a lot of motion blur in your image, then you set your shutter speed to a much lower value, and you're going to get that motion blur as if someone is in a dream sequence, or maybe they have been drugged or they're drunk or something like that. Normally we just observe that 180 shutter rule. Now to adjust our exposure, we're going to use 2 things to set our exposure, and that is we use our aperture and our ISO. The general rule is that you set your ISO to as low as you possibly can so that you reduce the amount of noise in your image. Now ISO is a bit more complicated than that, but that's a good place to start. So in this case, this camera goes down to ISO 100, that's the lowest. And then I go to my aperture and adjust my aperture until I get a good exposure on the image. Now we're going to go into more detail about using aperture for affecting your depth of field. And once you start using aperture for different reasons other than just exposure, then we have to play around with our ISO to get the right exposure. So for now, just know that you set your shutter speed to double your frame rate, you set your ISO to the lowest that you can go, in this case is 100, and then you use your aperture to get your right exposure. That's where you start, and then you can get a bit more complicated as you go. One thing about the Canon EOS-R is that you have many ways of accessing your menus, and this is one. So if I press the info button, I can cycle between different views, and that gives me access to the different menus. But I can also use the Q button on the camera, and that gives me another view where I can access these different settings and then make adjustments. Finally, there is the little button at the front called the multifunction button. When I press that, I also get these settings that I can change quickly. I have my ISO, and I also have my white balance when I press that. And that's how you set up your Canon EOS-R for shooting video. When you've done all those settings, you are ready to go. And we'll go deeper into the different things that you can then adjust while you're shooting to make your videos even look more professional. See you in the next episode of this series on the Canon EOS-R.